Let me remind every one of ourselves to take a moment and cultivate the highest form of motivation. We call it bodhicitta motivation, or the altruistic motivation, seeking complete enlightenment for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And with that kind of at least contrived bodhicitta motivation, we should participate in this discourse on understanding the mind. We are on page 106 of this text in English called Mind in Tibetan Buddhism. And as we talked about this, that mind could be classified into different types or categories. And so we have started to talk about the typology of 7 mental categories or types of mind. And so from this typology of 7 mental categories, last time we talked about what is doubt, on in Tibetan called Tenzin. And so in the middle of page 106, in small print, there is the definition of doubting mind or doubting consciousness. I quote, "The definition of a doubting consciousness is a knower which by its own power has qualms in 2 directions." In other words, as Geshe explained, that when we doubt about something, then we are not sure about what it is, and our mind could oscillate between the 2 things, right? It is uncertain about this and that. Okay, so that's what we call doubting mind or doubting consciousness, Tenzin. And as we said, there are 3 types of doubt. And so on page 108 in small print, you find that there are doubts which are tending towards the fact. We call in Tibetan Tenzin. If we think in terms of law of karmic action and results, and we are not sure about it, but we think that maybe that is what it is, right? We are our doubt is more oriented towards what it is, the fact. So that's one kind of a doubt. Or that there could be a doubt that is tending towards the opposite side or the negative side, if you will. We call it Tenzin, which is, while there is something called law of karmic action and results, maybe that's not true. So our kind of doubt is more oriented towards that it may not be true, right, on the negative side. Now there is a doubt, which is Chanya Buddhism, more like a balanced kind of a doubt. And when we think in terms of law of karmic action and results, we think that, well, I'm really not sure. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. I don't know. Okay, so our kind of diet is, equally fluctuating between the two sides. So that's called balanced kind of, doubt.
The Tongju is the Tongju the consequence of moving nasal to that. Lot of moving nasal to Nya to tell the Tongju to the Siwa. The moving nasal parting, Sinjalo, young ring, tell it, Tom you them Siwa.
No, so.
That did a kay by succession, Daniel wrote the Shiny was Siwa.
No, so.
What did it call it? It is a Siwa that the judge Karsa did the Rapid Medanya bus.
No.
So did that moon is the Yatirava?
No.
Rapid task is on that was a piece of Taba is a son of a ring to
No.
Home to the share. That guy keep out that everything at the less Shanya bus.
No.
This is what I want you.
So we are on page 108. So in other words, we said there are three types of doubting mind. And one is, it's a doubt, not so sure about what it is, but this doubt is more inclined or oriented towards the truth or the fact, what it is. And the example given in this text is that, sound may be impermanent, may be permanent. Maybe I think it is impermanent. So sound is impermanent, as we know. So our doubt is more kind of oriented or inclined towards what the truth is, what the fact is. So that is one kind of a doubt. And now the other kind of doubt is more like a doubting mind that is distant from what the truth is. It's further away from the truth or the fact. This is called Buddhism. We said sound may be permanent, impermanent. I think it's permanent. So as we can say, sound is impermanent, but we think it is maybe permanent. So this doubt is more distant from what the truth of the matter is. So this is another kind of doubt. Then the third one is more balanced kind of doubt. We said that sound could be permanent, impermanent. I'm not sure. I know it could be this or it could be that, right? So this is more of a balanced kind of a doubt. Yes.
Oh, that but the wrong Jew. Ranzin saw Nayas, telling ever dream in the very but Nala Mangi says. But Nala Mangi said, I think was on that was on the river. The wrong Jews and the Yugo the Takaji. So Nayas, no, in Bakanshila, the Tunisia make it the Nala Mangi say, because I just saw the Delia Muslim to the YouTube. You number did of Joan, I said, you mean Jigmar, you Joan, you the only shout, the only gonna be she called soup for his mother, quality for a missing Shia lost your mother. She said, till Temata, he says, you call same till the engage going on. She will Judas and Lamson Jones. She will what it means. You are same table means until Nalamangish. So the same to Indian was the demo chamber of Tadiana. Into a me catch a hen, she shells as will quiet Mara. Could the shells have what the Nalamang is what I can do. Timataki Meva. Timataki is an OD. When soldiers now with Tika same because so Thomas war. Simple took the category in the river.
So the next category of mind is called Nanglamage, Mange, indeterminate cognition or perception. Okay? So last night I was doing my homework. In this text, somehow the order got flipped, so we have to turn a few pages back. Okay? So if you turn to page 99, at the bottom in small print, so there is the definition of indeterminate cognition or perception, Nanglamange. And I quote, the definition of an awareness to which the object appears but is not ascertained, is a knower to which the specifically characterized phenomenon, which is its object of engagement, clearly appears, but which is unable to induce ascertainment with respect to it. And there's a long definition here. But as Geshe explained, so what it means is that indeterminate cognition or perception has to be ngunsum or direct perception. Okay? And so it's the kind of perception where an object could appear clearly, but then you don't ascertain what the object is. Okay? And why is that? Is because when our mind engages with its main object, the object of engagement is main object, right? It receives the clear appearance of the object, but it's lacking what we call immediately preceding condition factor. So therefore, the object does not register on the perception, so the perception does not ascertain what the object is. So we could find a lot of examples about this. Let's say if we are kind of watching sports, or we are watching our favorite show, right? We're completely kind of sucked into that, and then somebody says something to us. We heard the sound, but we didn't know what the person said, right? Because our mind is distracted. Our mind is absorbed into something, and then we either feel like we saw something, but we don't remember. What did we see? What did we hear? Right? We can't recall it properly. So this is what we call indeterminate perception or cognition. Nice. So now we are on page 103. In small print, there's mention of 3 types of indeterminate cognition or perception. And so these 3 pertain to sensory direct perceptions, mental direct perception, and metacognitive awareness or self-knower, rangri. Okay? And so in the case of sensory direct perceptions, this would include the 5 sensory direct perceptions, starting with what we call visual, a direct perception of a form, that's indeterminate cognition, to the what we call tactile sensory perception. So the 5 of them, and then there is mental direct perception that has been explained in this context. In other words, my footnote, we are not talking about mental direct perceptions arising out of meditative practices. Okay, and then they said there is also metacognition or meta-awareness rangri, a self-knower or a perception, And as a matter of fact, according to the schools where they accept metacognition, they said that every perception has its own metacognitive awareness or metaperception, rangri. And so maybe look at a perception, its last moment of continuum, it is so subtle that it has a metacognitive awareness, but that metacognitive awareness is indeterminate metacognitive awareness. It couldn't recall that last moment of the continuum of perception. So indeterminate cognitions or perceptions can be of three kinds: sensory, indeterminate cognitions, mental indeterminate cognition, and metacognitive indeterminate cognition. Okay, but there are no yogic, direct perceptions which are indeterminate cognition. The reason why is because yogic direct cognitions exist in the mind streams of transcendental beings or Aryas, and these yogic direct cognitions they must cognize or realize their objects. Yeah? So therefore, if a perception realizes its main object, it cannot be an indeterminate cognition. So that's the reason why we cannot talk about yogic direct perceptions or supermundane direct perceptions, which are indeterminate, indeterminate cognition. So on top of page 105, in small print, there is citation from Dharmakirti's commentary on Dignaga's compendium of prime cognition, and I quote, "From just seeing, the great intelligent ones ascertain all aspects." As Geshe explained, the great intelligent ones refer to superiors or transcendental beings, Aryas. So Arya beings, yogic direct perceptions, they perceive their main objects, and so therefore they cannot be indeterminate cognition or nangla mangepa in Tibetan. So now we'll go through the examples, of indeterminate cognitions or perceptions. So on top of page 106, in small print, you find the translation of the relevant passage from the text. And so as we said, indeterminate cognition can be sensory indeterminate cognitions, as a matter of 5 of them, from the visual to the tactile. And so one example would be fine, because then you can relate to the others as well, that when our mind is distracted by whatever, X, Y, Z, and maybe a blue color appears to our visual perception, but then we don't know, did we see blue or did we see yellow? Or did we see anything? We are not sure about it, right? So that is an example of indeterminate, sensory direct perception, where blue color appears clearly to our perception, but we just couldn't recall it because our mind was distracted, So that's one thing. And then we also said there could be indeterminate mental cognition or perception, which is like, when our auditory perception, sees its object, in this case, indeterminate one. So right after that, there arises what we call mental direct perception that follows. But it's so fast, momentary, right? It is the last moment continuum that, it is indeterminate mental cognition, because we couldn't recall it at all. Yeah. And then there is the example of indeterminate, metacognition is interesting one. So this is kind of a little contentious one, where it says metacognition of inferential cognition, inferential valid cognition in the minds of Charvaka or a hedonist or nihilist. Right? A nihilist are a particular, they ascribe to the things that anything you can see under your nose that exists, and beyond that nothing exists, right? So so the example given is metacognition of inferential valid cognition of a nihilist or hedonist or Charvaka. Okay? Now why I said this is a contentious issue is because usually we say that if your inferential cognition is a valid cognition, right, that means it really sees its main objects correctly, then the self metacognition of that valid cognition must also see, the metacognition itself. So therefore, it cannot be indeterminate one. Okay, so that is the contentious issue. So how would this be an example of indeterminate metacognitive awareness? But to understand this example, right, this example is presented in a kind of interesting way, is because Charvakas or the nihilists, they don't accept inferential valid cognition. They only accept direct, perceptions alone. Yeah? So therefore, even if there are any indirect, inferential valid cognitions that arise in their mind, right, they wouldn't know it because they don't accept it. Such things exist. For example, where, let's say there is Charvaka, not Sharvaka, Charvaka, so don't get it wrong. Charvaka is not the same as Sharvaka. Sharvaka is nihilist. So we say, well, on top of that mountain, somewhere there behind, there is fire because there is smoke. So based upon smoke as the sign of the reasoning, we can infer that there is fire, right, let's say behind that hill. And so that valid inferential cognition has a metacognitive awareness, which must really actually understand or sees its subjective mind. But because hedonist does not believe in such inference, right? So therefore, that metacognitive would become an indeterminate metacognitive awareness. Now I hope you get the point there, right? Yes.
What is that? Because that we just wrong Jew tribute Lohi saying tell a yen double Lohi, Domi Lohi means. Or the wrong Jews said that logic you won't know Jews who you said the top of you kiss a shire. But did not that Lohi because a wrong Jews said now you could do tell us what that causes here. On the top by the Tonsi told the top by the tree in Bicharo.
No, so.
The jewel to what jewel by the Pursuit of the good jewel tell the Pobashara.
No.
But the two Poba tree or what Tonsi told you, just wrong jewel tribute was. But Timothy did not treat him, but that did it. Top by the tree in Bicharo, that Ripta Sulodina.
No, so.
That Muslim like treating but that 도대바다 니도대바마도 해피지 고슴도 샘담바다 엄마도 트기 샤고르와 제가 트기 로기 샤고다 로기다 가 주유스 여기 쪼을 들라시고 여기 쪼저 가르서 배다 remote 찾아서 통하나 그 remote 찾아 통하는 디나 remote 가지는 까고 공부 서버 가져 강가 통도 거라와디 그럼 주유들 찾아서지 마데 디 remote 찾아서 그 주유 샤고르와 어 되지스 거 이 쪼서는
So from the typology of 7 mental categories, now the next one is called Logshe, which has been translated in this book called Wrong Consciousness Cognition. The latest translation is Distorted Cognition or Distorted Perception. And so now we have to flip a few pages ahead, as I said. So you're on page 109. In small print, there's the definition, and I quote, "The definition of a wrong consciousness or distorted consciousness is a knower which is mistaken with regard to its object of operation." The Tibetan term is called jugyu, object of engagement. Okay, and of course, a perception could have different kinds of objects. We have an appearing object, right? We have the object of engagement. We have the referent object, and we have the object of comprehension, things like that. And so the object of engagement, or jugyu in Tibetan, means it's the main object. Okay, so wrong consciousness or distorted consciousness, is mistaken with regard to its main object or the object of engagement. So usually when we talk about perception, we can say it could be conceptual perception or non-conceptual perception. Okay, Tokpa, Tibetan, conceptual cognition or perception. And so conceptual cognitions or perceptions, they are mistaken with regard to their appearing objects, nangyur, but they are not necessarily mistaken with regard to their objects of engagement or the main objects. Okay? In the case of conceptual cognition of a vase, a pot, right? This conceptual cognition, it apprehends or perceives the vase, its main object of engagement, but it's mistaken with regard to the appearing object, which is what we call the generic image of the vase. The generic image of the vase is mistaken to be the vase itself. Yeah? So therefore, conceptual minds or cognitions are necessarily what we call mistaken perceptions, mistaken with regard to their appearing objects. In the case of the direct perceptions or non-conceptual perceptions, and depending upon the schools of thought, some schools of thought, maybe lower schools might say that they are not mistaken perceptions. But in higher schools like Chittamatrin, mindfulness schools higher up, they might still talk about direct perception as being mistaken perceptions. So there are different perspectives on the direct perceptions as being mistaken or unmistaken.
어디 다들 얘는 똑바로 또미요 이니시 생이데 일본산지 똑바스 일본산지 똑바스 다디 배제는 생이가 같이 하디고 그 일본의 암조디야 동서 차도 거시데 잘 넣으시고 인지와 저디 추시야 지면도 일본산지 똑바스 애는 가사 당시 뭐라 랑서 다시 지 답이 봐서 생이샤도 봐 일본산지도 보셨나 이거 가사 당시 현 고인진과 직발이다 또벌로 이게 생이로 와 니발라 가르사 언시지베다 될 로시다 언이게 지다 이시와 이게 인시 언이스도 건도 어버 수신 매고 오네 애들 류장보다게 어버 수신보다게 언이시 대다 많이 받고 삼로 들어가서 20점 된 게들 아니 언시 많이 받으시고 어디다 어버 수신되게 제가 20점 되게 이유시고라 언시 지베다 20점 되니 래 다니나 게 다와니나 게 언기다 거르고 보나요 언기다 통보 스타티니가 애네 어버 수신 받는 게 들어와 다 공부서 나야 그래서 공부서 나야 사와나 밀름 지시바도 이바이 비셔스 당어도 니는 가도잖아 아도 고보 그 맥고보 서버 가린데 시도바 히고 통화들이 미아요로 와 시도 드디고 거 고보 나요 어시 거라 요 말와
Lade.
어디셔 나도 이바디 인시 시지베디 인시
So distorted cognition or lokshe could be conceptual distorted cognition, tokpa lokshe, or non-conceptual distorted cognition, tokme lokshe. Okay? And so what are some of the examples if you ask? We are on page 110. So we are going to, let me see, let me see, did I skip something? Oh, here. At the bottom of page 109 and then 110. Anyway. So let's talk about distorted conceptual cognition, Tokpa Lokshe. Two examples are given. One, for example, we can say that if we see as if, this kind of perked of ears of a rabbit are nothing but horns on a rabbit, right? That is an example of distorted conceptual cognition. And why this is used in that Buddhist text is maybe it's easy to get confused that when the rabbit's horns are perked up, standing from long distance, you might think it has horns, but it isn't, right? So that is a conceptual distorted cognition. And the other example is our conceptual grasping at self, right, of a person, that is distorted conceptual cognition because there is no intrinsic self, right? So now there are non-conceptual distorted cognitions, tongme lokshe, and examples given, or there could be, sensory non-conceptual direct distorted cognitions, such as due to some eye defect, you might see there are two moons, right? So that is sensory distorted perception. There are no two moons anywhere, but you kind of see there are two moons. It is double vision, as you might say, of the moon, or that somebody due to some eye defect might see white snow mountain as being blue mountain. Well, there are no blue mountains, so that's the distorted sensory direct perception. Okay. Now there are non-conceptual distorted mental cognition as well. And the example is when you are dreaming, and then you're dreaming that you have seen all this kind of beautiful colors and everything else, that is a distorted non-conceptual mental perception. Why? Because you couldn't see colors at night because your sensory perceptions don't exist, don't function. You are snoring. Geshe didn't say that. So if you think that in my dream I saw these beautiful colors of the rainbow, everything, is a distorted perception because there couldn't be colors perceived in the dreaming state because sensory perceptions don't function here. Okay? Yes.
Lorig dindi ya di zoro dadi lorig yega sombi yegor di yeda de dere da ganje gagenan dior benanzo ngobol kaza yeba na di yedi da ne shije ne somno di ya de ya tangu yin se anja demba yin se anja o direk cheni kaji relena ge shije ga diru yego menja de mongbo yero o di chigwa de lorig yeda de 다들 그 이거 먼저 아래마도 시 더다 뉴디야 대랑제 뭐 처박해요 말아.
So we have gone through this typology of seven mental categories. As I said earlier, that mind may be classified into different types of classification. The exhaustive sort of thing, not all inclusive necessarily, my footnote by the way, is the seventh typology of seven mental categories. Now we will go to the two mental categories. So this is a matter of classification because even if you talk about two, these are included within the typology of seven mental categories. As we can say, objects of knowledge or phenomena could be classified into permanent and impermanent, right? It's classification. Or we could classify the objects of knowledge into three kinds: but all three kinds could be subsumed into two kinds, So it's a matter of classification, and so that's what we should remember. Sorry, I skipped something. We are on page 111, unnumbered. Right on the top in small prints, first we deal with classifying mind into three types or three categories before we get to the two. The three categories of mind are conceptual consciousness that take a meaning generality as the apprehended object. Now the latest translation would be, conceptual cognitions that take the universal as their objects. And so these, in other words, are the conceptual cognitions, because conceptual cognitions, they perceive to them, the images of the objects appear. That's the generality or the universality of the objects appear to those cognitions. So therefore, these are the perceptions where the universal, is apprehended as its object. So all the conceptual thoughts or conceptual cognitions belong to this category, in other words. The second one is called non-conceptual, non-mistaken consciousness that take a specifically characterized phenomenon as the apprehended object. The latest translation is that this is non-conceptual, unmistaken direct perception that takes the unique, particular as its object, right? The particular as its object. And so all the non-conceptual direct perceptions belong to this category. Okay? Now the third one is called non-conceptual, mistaken consciousness that take a clearly appearing non-existent as their apprehended object. I haven't seen the latest translation on this, but it doesn't mean if I didn't see it doesn't exist. It might. So what this is, just to be simple, is that something doesn't exist, but yet looks like it appears to the conscious, to a perception as if it exists. But that's basically a distorted cognition or lokshe, right? A distorted, cognition. Yes. So if anybody is somehow following Tibetan text, we are on page 50. But in the English translation, we are on page 116, unnumbered 116. So right on the top in small print, now we are moving into classifying, mind into, dual kinds or, two mental categories. Yeah, and so there are many ways to do that. We could classify the mind into valid and non-valid cognitions, right? Tsema, valid pramana, and then tsema mimba, non-valid cognitions or perceptions. So this classifying mind into two. Or we could classify the mind into unmistaken perception or cognition and mistaken cognition or perception, shushe and matuvisheba. Or we can classify the mind into sensory perception and mental perception, wangshe and yishe. Okay? Or we can categorize the mind into, primary mind and secondary minds or mental factors, sem chung. Or we can classify the mind into perceptions that engages its object via or through exclusion, seljuk, and the perception that engages its object through affirmation or via affirmation, dumju. So two types of mind. So we can classify the mind into two of different kinds.
Sama ding changi ma yin de ding le mang no mi gu xing nyung no min di we shers mo jan di changi lo do se we changi yin je pu su se we changi ma yin de sama na ding kharu yin be ma ja we she de cher sama ding kharu sha jo ge we shers o ti de do da karsa sa de mi lo ri ba se da da ne yen nguzu sama she jeba sama yin she en sama yin she yang ban nguzu sama yang ban jeba sama di ka ru yin go res o da ti yin ma ka ma yi sama yo ma res re ba ma no me ko yun no me ndu se de zan nguzu sama ji wo khan nya di ba jeba sama yo re ba jeba sama ji wo khan nguzu ma le di ba da ko yin shi ni de go ro ba da ko yin ma ti do do jo ko yin ma to zan me ro shi da 로도 체 로이드 거 되게 처음에 잖아 이네 뭐는 거 뉴는 되어 인시 그래서 문제에서 원전디 장애 로도세요 장애인지 풍수세요 장애인데 마인드 다들 딱세 답이게잖아요 우리다 맞아 그렇지다 세마이나 되가지고 서마지와서 그러면 이제 주다 세마도 가르치 나네 저서 해 말아 어디 다 책뭐 더달도 가요 말아 또 땅에도 책 계잖아요 봐 다들 말도 내도 못 우리
So as we said, that mind could be classified into different sets of, two categories. The first one is the mind could be classified into valid mind or valid cognition and non-valid cognition. Yeah. So what is the definition of valid cognition? Yeah. And so in Tibetan it's called Sardu Milwe Rigpa. On page 116, in small print, they defined, I quote, the definition of prime cognizer, that means valid cognition, is a new incontrovertible knower. So if we go back to the Tibetan definition, sardu means newly or prime, okay, and miluwa means unmistaken. Rigpa is a cognition or knower, okay, and of course this definition is accepted by Sevatandika, Madhyamika, and schools below in Buddhism. Yes, and they said that a valid cognition has to be a prime cognition or new cognition. That's what they're saying. Sardu. The Tibetan word literally sarva means new, right? But it has been translated as prime. But Prasangikas would not accept, would not agree with that definition. Prasangikas would say that a valid cognition doesn't have to be prime or newly. and so that's the Prasangika, a standpoint. And so when we think in terms of any valid cognition or sema, it has to be, one of the two kinds. Either it has to be direct valid cognition, nusum sema, or it has to be inferential valid cognition, cheba sema. Right? There cannot be any other valid cognition. So these two types of valid cognitions are kind of all-inclusive categories. Right? If something is a valid cognition, either it has to be direct valid cognition or it has to be inferential valid cognition. And there's no need for the third category. Less than two will not do. If we say that, well, valid cognition is inferential, well, what about the direct valid cognition? But if you say, well, valid cognition is only direct perception, right? Then what about inferential? But we do need the two types of valid cognition, direct valid cognition and indirect valid cognitions, because all valid cognitions are inclusive in these two, but we don't need the third category. Okay? And then, of course, like from debating point of view, we don't really need it here. That's what Geshe was saying. But then somebody says, well, if you say that, valid cognitions has to be one of the two, then what about the valid cognition as a generic term? Which one is it, right? Not in particular, valid cognition as a general term. Is it an inferential valid cognition or is it a direct valid cognition, right? So that's how in the debate system people will start to kind of test you. But we don't need to do that, as Geshe said. We can,
Semal uzun mu diyor ama işte. Da zaten var şu tek cücük diyor. Da maşadi semal somcu diyor da. Da Tenzin Dorjee eni da çıcavsa da peki somsum diyor. Kaçın düzü mü da gördü. Şimdi da beşi tabii Geshe Gyeltsen yüzü da kodu şeyda sema eni cibu uzun cibu diyor da. Eni somda şingan diyor da. Gelugpa ribe yanda bakani den kariki diyorsun da bu ne zaman yindi den ki varız. O da namcı kodu den ki bu domne ne bir karsa da söylüyor da da biz zor duruydu.
Now we are on a page. Let me see. 119, so you can see there in small print that according to Dharmakirti's valid cognitions or the reasoning, he talks about only two types of valid cognitions: direct valid cognition and inferential valid cognition. Less than two will not do, more than two is not needed, and all valid cognitions are inclusive within these two kinds. Of course, when you look at other schools of thought, they have different viewpoints. For example, Charvaka, not Sharvaka, nihilists only accept direct valid cognitions. They don't believe in inferential valid cognitions. So that's a little too few, isn't it? And then another philosopher is called Sarikaba. He said there are 11 types of valid cognitions. Okay? But many other schools, such as Tangjenpa, enumerators, and others, they would usually talk about 3 types of valid cognitions. So, as Geshe said, Dharmakirti, right, looking all across all of them, he said what? Because when you look at the objects of knowledge, phenomena, right, they could be only classified into 2 kinds, manifest and hidden. So therefore, we only need, or we could have 2 types of valid cognitions: direct valid cognitions and inferential valid cognitions. So we don't need more than that.
干这么长有准备去罗萨，那这么了，养这么了也能让人给这么，当现在给这么你有这样一个学不起来，是可能的，可能当我研究个的，因为第一的就当你的，但可能那个是呢，然后这下当时呢，这么了让人给这么的，现在给这么你下个认识，让现在大家他都吧。一度那把没把让你们说让到你把这啥都没了，这把让人给这么生意。真正没那把心中谈你的这么现了第二个月啥都没了，这个，那现在给这么生意影响。我底下我他有这种些呢，让现在等于他头把些呢，这是我的。那个他了老的可能开始是到头样的感觉。也这些没有，听见这个车上上那个有开始是劳动学徒的是，可能你把这叫什么？我的叫他呀，这里现在等于他都都是的。变成你这就是那他交在这啥些呢？的交在的没大把的，可现在他交在这边没些的，现在他的想法是吧？可是是你交在这边没些的了，交在没大都要可能你把要嘛是吧？现在等于他的想法的。是吧？但可能这听见的呢，到头来现在等于他都行了。我这说的是我，现在等于他是这样说的，这就是这个。可是当不了也是同恐怕的，我这现在等于他都是他，你这一上理解的，马路呢，有啥子了人把现在是这样的，当不了也是同恐怕这个我是。我的车嘛，同性那些有人车嘛，人我是车嘛，那些我是，就是把个车嘛的俺也是的，人也车嘛的俺也是我是吧？这是我，人是车嘛的俺也是。这一必须的，派出所这边我这个当不是，同恐怕就是还是有点的，不这个爸爸别写的那个，爸爸的个。老上的天都要这么下个了，这同恐怕就是个是吧？可是啊，这一的不愿意派出所这边，那我说到不同不当，没做这个同性那边这边，民事项目的100些，同性那些什么些的没说对吧？同的可能系列刚刚这边什么些，可是啊。没做这个同性那边这什么，我是开始，我是100，什么娘子人我是那不说吧，但让给开始，但你嘛，那时候让我是什么，那时候我是什么，就是把什么黑油塞到，好像他让人给什么的黑油，但底下那让人给什么被掐死。但现在你怎么的用这种笑是吧？我说怎么那时候怎么都以为其实是怎么把我怎么等诚信的必须把人把些，把也送人把些，没做事给，没做事情呢，没讲了都能做事给定在那年头嘛是吧？做事情都没给。不行是吧？咱吃亏啊！的，他你我这个是吧？过去年的娘多人给介绍，我这没做事是吧？是吧？但这个没把大人我也那个没得通过什么的，可做事个小孩子通嘛是吧？我这是我的。可是啊，没做，没，通过了人通我什么我是那这些推举派这边些。没做这个同学们那边这边，你像我这边100，什么样子人我是都说吧，但看上咱们我都被一些都被失败，然后大的失败都不我把一笔写上，我到底参与的这下的我这那看见，同恐怕是呢。说是被控制住，让到的下线的，现在这个下呢，那样怎么讲啊？这些，那他你话晓得可有的可系列都刚刚样年头啊，这些，但家人不现在这年头嘛，我现在但他人没做这个这些， 다 체마 냠스 라리 고스도와 시다다 체마 냠스 요 라리나 데로 롤링이 체마미 겨워라
No.
This is the job of Jivasama Pisamagira. With Gaza, 7 years of super. Kazak, Damitabi, Ishida Shiva Inse.
No.
The style did like the junior, Dima, Tangara Java, said Mawi, some Shotas Mediva.
No. So we have talked about classifying mind into valid mind or cognition and non-valid cognition. That's one way of classifying mind into two types. Yeah. And another way of classifying mind into two types, something this could be. This is a little bit difficult to translate in English. Probably you get it the sense from reading the translation, even in the book. Ranglenge Sema means it is self, literal translating, self-ascertainment or certainty-based cognition or perception. Shenlenge Sema would be other certainty-based kind of cognition. Hope this gets clearer through as we go through the definitions of each and the examples of each. Okay, so got to be a little patient. My first footnote today. So we are on page 123, right on the top. Let me quote this and then translate all the explanation given. Geshe has. In another way, prime cognizers, valid cognitions, are of two kinds. Those which induce ascertainment by themselves. This is what I call self, ascertainment or certainty-based cognition. And those when ascertainment is induced by another, induce certainty or ascertainment cognition. So there are two types of valid cognitions. Okay? And the definition of the first is it is a new incontrovertible knower which is able to induce through its own power ascertainment that itself would not arise if the final nature of its object of comprehension did not abide in the object. I'll stop there because there's a lot of things to deal with here. One of the technical aspects of this definition is what is meant by the final nature of its object of comprehension. Okay, and as Geshe explained, what that really means is a perception, whatever is what called ability to be able to ascertain, right, characteristics of its object. Let's say example given by Geshe is the table, right, and our visual perception has the ability to be able to ascertain, certain characteristics of the table. So what is able to ascertain its characteristics by its own power, that's what called self-ascertainment. Okay? For example, table is impermanent. That's one of the characteristics of the table. But our visual cognition perception has no ability to ascertain the impermanence of the table. Okay? So the final nature here means that whatever characteristics or the qualities of the object that it could ascertain, that's what we call the final nature of the object of comprehension. Okay, so this kind of prime cognition, by its own power, able to ascertain the final nature of its object of comprehension. So that's one kind of valid cognition, and so there are 5 of them, which we will go through a little later. The other kind of valid cognition is cognition whose ascertainment is induced by another is an incontrovertible knower that's unable to induce such ascertainment on its own, but must depend on another later conventional prime cognizer. So that is the definition of the cognition that is dependent upon something else to be able to ascertain its final nature of the object of comprehension. I know there's a lot of technical things, so probably you're looking at my face. So the first one, I call it, just to simplify it, self-certainty ascertainment-based cognition. Let's call it Ranglang Sema in Tibetan. And there are 5 kinds. Yeah. The first one is, let me see. At the bottom of page 123 in small prints, it says there are 5. Sense direct prime cognizers having a familiar object. What this means is that through certain familiarity, that we are able to experience certain kind of valid cognition. The example given here is that of a child, who can validly cognize, recognize his or her mom or dad's, right? Because a child is so familiar with his or her parents that he or she can validly cognize the form of mom or dad, and that kind of valid cognition is by the power of familiarity. It's through familiarity, right? That's one kind. Okay. The second one is sense direct cognizers to which the ability to perform a function appears. As Geshe says, this is valid cognition where whatever is, so to speak, in front of it, then it's not only able to see its object, but it's also able to see the functionality. The example Geshe has given is that if we are sitting close by a fire, not only know we can perceive validly the function of the fire is to burn, to cook, right, to boil. But we can also see that the fire can cook food, it can boil water, right? So when we are close up. So that kind of valid cognition is because of proximity and witnessing the functionality of a phenomenon. If the fire is way far away, then we don't know the fire can cook or boil or anything, right? We cannot see it, directly, because we are dealing with what called direct perceptions here. The third, kind is a self-knower or metacognition awareness, rangri. So in other words, metacognitive awareness of a valid cognition. Tsema rangri. A valid cognition has its own metacognitive awareness. Geshe was chuckling over this. Remember that earlier we get the example of how metacognition of inferential valid cognition of a nihilist is an indeterminate cognition, right? It cannot be, actually, right? But of course we explain why that example is given in that context already. So we're not going to go back to that. My footnote. Number 4 is the yogic, direct perception and the valid perception, yogic valid perception, which is wisdom validly realizing selflessness, right? Cognizing selflessness of a person. So that is valid yogic perception. Then the 5th one is, as it says here, inferential valid cognition, which is, we often talk about how, we realize that sound is impermanent because it is a product. Okay, anything that's a product must necessarily be impermanent. So that is inferential valid cognition. So all of those 5 valid cognitions are called Ranglang Sema, self-ascertainment, perceptions or valid cognitions. Nice.
Rangling just about Rangling, yes, so did it. Touring is the done this or that can't you? She really give it. And it did it. Corsa. Talk about the almost some of the was getting touring in him. That Rangling is there, Rangling goes some shit. And never goes to the young. Papa goes on the yard, so the Rangers was there, or take a Rangers. 다 디가 지바 세마 잡인도 디가 디 거루이나 런링이 세마 미차게 레스텔야 셴링이 세마 요마레로.
Yes. Now we are on, let me see, page 128. So based upon the work of great Sakya Pandita, the great Sakya scholar, treasure of reasoning, they said that when we talk about Rangling Sema, valid cognitions that are able to ascertain their final objects of comprehension by their own power, that's what the Rangling Sema means, are 5 kinds. And so the 5 we already talked about, right? How valid cognition arises through familiarity, how valid cognition arises because of the proximity, being able to witness the function of a fire burning or cooking water, for example. And so those are called, are dealing with what called those 2 plus, sorry. And then the metacognitive awareness, Ranglik, and then the yogic direct perception, and then inferential valid cognition. These all 5, all of this, right, valid cognitions are cognitions that can ascertain their final objects of comprehension by their own power. That ascertainment does not need to be induced by any other factor or things. Okay.
What is the just one running? Start you by healing it some of the condition. Healing it some of dead jury go there, no running a damn by healing a was. Still running a cheva healing a no one needs running about some use. Saying told me may Kado, you don't may Kado, me, Tenzin said the young Bukado Malam is almost the tongue bush. Told the Shaba in his Tobe Shaba, Tenzin said the young boots, Shinzian with the Yipata. Cool mobile tongue, Modern, but Tenzin Jabba Chevy. Almost the surviving pieces, the Dayan, Tayan Tamboni, Murdans, Tamani, Tabar Jaws. That did a concept. No only the never hearing here was Tirani, Cheba hearing, but no one is hearing also Tambol, Teredo, Tiran, because no only the never hearing here was here, did it. George Boca better Kados, Marvels, May Kado in the Kari, Marvel, the Canadian women, Hamo, but the Leggings in the Mikita, and boy, the Tongue Miki, the thing was that. No one only the machine here was. Or did no one only use the Kado Malam, because the Netamo on the South Tongo. That could make her in, but the Kari made it till she would change her to Marva.
No.
She had that till little. That may cut the Tayiton, may cut the Regas, and Sema Hendagia, so Tayit some of the Omar.
No.
Said that the machine here was. No one cut a marrow could so the that may cut away with Sema Hendaji ten years, and no one doing the machine here was. That didn't only Shabai, double Shabai, Shabas, I think I did in a Shingy Chabas red one.
No.
Because it Tondago Shabai and say. Don't be shot by me, Tenzin, and till less than that, because she shot by him, I tell you the and Chaber hearing us. Shaba Hing Chaber, what she does on that, but she with the Kadoma Haku, because Shaber Hing Haku, or did till letting you
No.
or this year. That this somebody that hearing the Mari, hearing it, Samajama, who over Tom, Tenzin was said. That dinner, that Judy goes somewhere, mother. No one is neither hearing and of course, Samari Marva.
No.
What is the somebody that Tabai, Tamboni the time when they're hearing it, someone saying about it.
No, so we have to do a little bit of flipping back and forth. We are on page 125. In the middle of the page, in small prints, now we are dealing with prime cognitions or valid cognitions, where the ascertainment is induced by another perception, if you will. And so let me quote the text and then translate the explanation given. When prime cognizers, when ascertainment is induced by another, are terminologically divided, there are three. Those when ascertainment of the appearance is induced by itself, but ascertainment of the truth is induced by another. 1. When ascertainment of the general is induced by itself, but ascertainment of the particular is induced by another. That's 2. And when ascertainment of even the mere appearance is induced by another. So there's a 3 types of cognition here. And now the example given of the first one, which is those when ascertainment of the appearance is induced by itself, but ascertainment of the truth is induced by another. I know it's such a long thing to translate here. Even in Tibetan it's long, by the way. Not as long as that. Means the appearance, whatever the appearance is ascertained by itself. Okay? But whatever that truth is, whatever the reality is ascertained by something else. That's what we're talking about. That's the first category. Okay? The example Geshe Gyeltsen has given is, let's say, at a very far off place, there is this kind of a glowing red kind of thing there, and it is the color of a fire. The red, the reddish glowing red is the color of the fire. That's what the truth is. Okay. So from this distance, we don't see the fire, but we see the redness, isn't it? So that redness appearance is appearing to our perception. So that appearance is ascertained properly. It's a red. You don't see it's a yellow or burgundy, anything. It's just red. But is it the color of the fire that is the truth? We don't know. So how would we know that truth? It's only when we walk towards that place. And now we say, before I saw something red at this distance, and I thought it was the color of the fire. Now it is the color of the fire. So the truth, the color of the fire is induced by some other valid cognition, isn't it? So the appearance in the beginning is ascertained properly, it's a red color, but it's the color of the fire which the truth is ascertained later on when you come in its proximity by other valid cognition. So it's induced by another. So that's one example. The second one is those, let me see, when ascertainment of the general is induced by itself, but ascertainment of the particular is induced by another. The example given of this is, let's say, at a far off distance, the example given in the text is Ashoka tree. It's okay. But at a distance, you see there is a tree, because every tree is called trees. That's a generic term, isn't it? But you don't know it's Ashoka tree. Maybe in California, we should use the redwood tree, right? So as a far off, it's a redwood tree, but we don't know it's a redwood tree. We just only see tree. So the appearance of tree to our perception is ascertained, right? That's correctly. But it is a redwood tree that is not ascertained yet. So how would we know? We will go there to the forest and be like, this is the redwood tree. This is Ashoka tree. So therefore, the particularness of the tree, that particular unique tree, because the redwood tree is different from other trees, is ascertained by another valid cognition. Okay, that's the second kind. The third one, Geshe Gyeltsen says, it's just included there, but it is not a valid cognition per se. It's just simply called takpawa. It's simply called a valid cognition, but it isn't a valid cognition. That is when ascertainment of even the mere appearance is induced by another, right? Because usually to be able to perceive anything, you have to be able to ascertain appearance first, right? Otherwise, how can you get to the object itself? So this is simply called takpawa, imputed one, but it isn't a valid cognition.
Then ya ta yer chena any chaba de in the ani in the michai kari in the ta yer did the because don't do the jia yorwa.
No.
I didn't ya less that's the pinja motion and ta yor and the shin washing raw.
No.
Or didn't say the don't do rim jia the what jagangal this is what that sharing it some.
I don't know. So. So cognitions, whose ascertainment of its object is induced by another one. So I just try to simplify it. What it really means is, for example, like in a very far off place, we see something there. We don't know if it's a rock or it is a sentient being, animal, right? We don't know. So then as we kind of walk a little closer to that, now we realize, well, it's not an inanimate rock, it's an animate being, okay? So that means, at least now we have been able to differentiate between the inanimate object and the animate one, right? At least some wrong conception is eliminated. Then as we come close to that, we realize, oh, it's not an animal, it's a human being, right? Now we are able to clear up some other misconceptions, perception. Wow, so it's a human, okay? Still, we are not really sure 100%, what kind of human is this. Then we come closer. Oh, it's a monk or a nun, not a lay person. See that? So now we get better and better with ascertaining what that object is, okay? And then as we come closer, well, it's my son who is a monk now, right? See, your family member, right? So this is how now you come to see what the whole truth is. So this kind of cognitions, the perceptual experiences we have, these are called, in a fancy way, other, certainty-based perceptions or cognitions, okay? So we will stop there today and we will respond to your questions. Let me get my page numbers correctly so that Alfredo 아직 되시나? 네, 쉬는 게 아니라 쉬어.
저도 추 마추 니수이에 야와 마샤베 빈제 카인 감스. 정말 되게 농구샤도 저도 추 마추 니수이에 야와 마샤베 빈제 카인.
알레니 셔도가 알레 저도 추면 알레 맞아 표바제 인사로 하게. 다기 간저 게다 셰발이야 야와니 셔데 세마다 세미 로바게 센데신지 뭐샤로와 저도 추 맞아 라게 야와지 샤마도 가르쳐버려라 그도 사게. 저도 취업에 마주해 여러 가게 이와 취업에도 돼 가르치면은 쓰기도 사.
이제 처음에 재미있어야 다 디게 잡으려고 말이야.
그거 저도 취업에 다 가서더라고. 알았어. I think looks like there was one in Tibetan. So that's because we talk about classifying mind into different sets of two, right? Valid cognition, non-valid cognition, primary mind, mental factors, and all of that. Then he said, how come that the mind has not been classified into chodoche, means that in ascertainment and non-ascertainment kind of thing. Okay, and Geshe said, well, that's actually what the valid cognition is and non-valid cognition is, right? Valid cognition ascertains its object, and non-valid cognition does not ascertain its object. So it actually belongs to that. So thank you very much.